Hey, everybody. I hope that you are all doing well as we roll into what looks to be a hot week. But welcome to week 4. You have made it to the last week of class. I know that this thing has been going fast and furious. I just said that as some product placement so that maybe the movies can give me some money. But anyways, it has been. And, congrats. For the most part, you're all doing a great job. I'm working on worked on your reports over the weekend. And so you should have the grades for that. And you get a sense of what's going at. You've already gone through 2 tests. I'm sure you're happy to have the report behind you, 2 tests behind you. The test 3 is the same idea. So it just covers the last chapters, and so you're just getting to be a pro at all of this. I do want to throw a couple things out before I hit the materials. One is that I don't know if all of you know that I'm making comments. And so I'm trying to help you all out. If you do a good job, I'm just going to say good job, great job, excellent job, whatever. If I think that you're on the right track and all of that is good, then we just go from there. But if there's something that needs to be done, for example, in your reflection observations, I ask you to put the prompt above your reply. Some of you have been splitting it up, and that's okay. It makes it a little harder for me with the word count, but it's fine. And or you can just put it at the top. Please understand that my words don't count as your word count. So when you're having to come in on that, the stuff that I give you doesn't count towards that. And if you're doing a good job on these, hitting the 250 words on the reflection observations isn't even hard to do. Some of you are going way beyond that. And I really appreciate the extra effort. Again, remember, minimum. If you hit the minimums, that means you're getting the minimum grade, passing grade, so like a C. If you're under that, obviously not. And if you're doing the extra work, then you get the extra. So that's how all of that works. So, really be thoughtful. Spend some time thinking about this. My criteria always for classes is you need to set a goal for yourself of what you would be happy. So not everybody is going to go for an A, and that's fine. I totally get that. I'll give you a perfect example. When I was in college, I made a big mistake. Let this be good advice to you. The classes that you don't look forward to taking, don't wait till the very end. Get those done as early as you can. I made the mistake of waiting and putting off biology, and so I ended up taking it my very last semester, and that was a big mistake because I was burned out. If you think senioritis in high school is bad, in college it's really bad. This is for my undergraduate, and then of course I rolled right into graduate work. But it was a struggle. It was hard to do, but I was like, you know what? If I get a C in this class, I'm fine. I was never going for the high GPA. I was just, if I could end up somewhere between 3.0, 3.2, I'd be totally cool. That changed when I did my master's, but that's a different story. And so, how you define the success in a class is up to you. Some people, it's like, I got to get an A, all A's, whatever. Some are like, I'm cool with a C, and there's the saying, if you haven't heard it, C's get degrees. And as I mentioned in one of the posts, the reality is that once you get out of school, no one will ever ask you what your GPA was again. So if you're like knocking yourself out, breaking everything just to get a great GPA, keep in mind that the GPA is only for you getting to the next level of schooling. And sometimes even then it's not a huge issue. It's becoming less of one in some ways. So, unless you're, really trying to compete for those top things, don't even sweat it. Here's another secret for you high schoolers. If you go to, and this is becoming less of an issue too, but if you go to community college, let's say you go and you do a year or 2 there before you transfer, you don't even have to take your SAT or ACTs. They don't even ever come into play. They don't ask. Maybe rarely it'll show up, but nobody cares. So now colleges are finally wising up to the standardized testing and not requiring them because it's its own little racket and all of that. So my point is that, for you, decide what is successful for you. And then go for that. But if you want that A, work for the A. Another thing real quick, I've had a student or two ask about the books on the bookshelves behind me, along with all the other stuff. I have started, there's a section in the very last module, which are just sort of all odds and ends, cool stuff that's in there. I'm starting to put together my sort of just suggested reading list, because people have asked periodically, hey, what are those books and what do you recommend? So I'm building a basically an unordered list of some things. You can see a couple right behind me. I just recently finished this music from the Cosmic Barrio, a music series by Beto Arcos, who I know, and it's a really cool book, introduction to a lot of cool stuff. But mostly like Latin music and from South America and Central America and even from here. But it's really cool. So if that's your thing, that's one of the things I'm kind of passionate about. So, yeah. So now we're heading into the last week, the last chapter. So you've got 5 chapters again, and that very fast recap. As you know from the beginning, you learned about blues and jazz. We got into R&B, we got into rock and roll, and then we got into the 60s, where everything started to split. And you learned about progressive rock, and you learned about art rock, and you learned about jazz rock and folk rock and psychedelic rock and hard rock and heavy metal and all of those. And so that continues on in the pop music world. It just continues to spread, and there's cycles. Hopefully you're starting to get the sense of that, and you can see these waves coming through. And so this last chapter, or this last week, you're going to cover 5 chapters. So you're going to we're going to go through punk rock and new wave, funk and disco, hip hop and rap, pop and alternative rock, and then alienated rock, and back to roots rock. We end with Bruce Springsteen, which is always my design, because he is definitely one of the greats. And there are a lot of rock historians that say that the 2 artists that really saved, or artists/bands that really saved rock and roll, if you will, you can think about what that means, are the Ramones and Bruce Springsteen. So you'll learn more about that. So, we've learned about all these different offshoots, and you're going to learn about punk rock. Remember, again, nothing exists in a vacuum. So punk rock had its influences from Detroit with bands like Iggy Pop and the Stooges, and the MC5 from New York with the Velvet Underground. And then it led into punk, particularly out of a club called CBGB's in New York, in the Bowery District. And it was an amazing, amazing scene where you had the New York Dolls and the Ramones and Television and Blondie and the Talking Heads, all working out of this club, all honing their craft, getting good at what they did out of the spotlight, because they were not the pop bands. They couldn't play the big clubs in downtown and in the New York scene proper, and so out of that, this scene exploded. Now I do sometimes ask about the roots of punk and who the early punk bands were and all of that, and so sometimes people will the tendency is to sort of read the intro of the book, maybe read the beginning, and so they'll talk about, well, the punk bands of the MC5 and the Velvet Underground or whatever, and those aren't punk bands. They are precursors to punk. We don't really get to punk until we get to the Ramones, and then they, in turn, through Malcolm McLaren, influenced and the creation of and popularity of the Sex Pistols, which was a British punk band, and they really were hugely influential. When you listen to the Sex Pistols, what you get is a lot of the sound of the Ramones combined with the politics that were going on, because it was very different in the States versus England. In England, they were going through a lot of high unemployment. There was a garbage strike. There was a lot of disenfranchised youth squatting in empty buildings, because there really was not a future for them. They didn't know what they were going to do. So there was a lot of political anger, particularly against the monarchy, which recognized that they had all this power and all this money, and they were really out of touch. There was a lot of class division. There was racial strife. A lot of the things that we see there. So you're going to learn about that. And then the Sex Pistols, they were only around for a couple of years, from 76 to 78. But in that time, then they influenced bands here back in the States. There was a burgeoning punk scene that came out on the West Coast with Dead Kennedys up in San Francisco, and bands like Black Flag and Circle Jerks and the Germs and X here in the Southern California, and then into bands like the Adolescents and Social Distortion. So you'll learn about some of those. I put that information in there. There are some longer documentaries, so don't feel like you have to watch all of those unless you find it interesting to you. I know for some of the students over the years, the toughest parts of the class was either progressive rock or punk rock. It may not be your cup of tea, but without punk rock, you don't get bands like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, And then you don't also get bands like the Pixies. Without the Pixies, you don't get Nirvana. Without Nirvana, it goes on and it goes on, right? Nothing exists in a vacuum. And so you'll learn about that. And then we're going to jump back over for a couple of chapters into the continuation of black music. So it's kind of interesting because music still has some segregation going on. Not intentionally and not by design. This isn't a systemic racist type of thing. This is just the way that sometimes music and culture divides, and then there's crossovers here and there. I'd argue that we still probably see remnants of it today. But so you think about black music coming through with R&B, and then into soul and Motown, and then out of that, we talked about James Brown, and that's how we get to the beginning of funk. And then with funk, you get James Brown, then Sly and the Family Stone, Parliament Funkadelic, George Clinton from Parliament, produced Red Hot Chili Peppers' Freaky Styley and really pushed that funk angle with them. You get funk, and then at the same time, you get disco. Funk and disco are different things, and they have some crossover in audiences, but there's distinct differences. In one of the documentaries I used to show, I think it was Gloria Gaynor, who talked about that disco was basically like black music simplified for white folks, because the beat was so easy and simple to dance to. And disco ended up, really, it never went away, because there's always been dance music. Think about going back to the beginning of the class, and as humans, dancing is part of the social fabric. It's part of what cultures do. Pretty much all cultures have dance in one respect or another. And so, from disco, that leads us eventually to, house and in all sorts of electronic dance styles, and EDM, which we still see today. If you are seeing, folks like Skrillex and Deadmau5 and David Arquette and all these other people, you can still see those DJs. That is a continuation of the disco culture and subculture. There was a lot of sex tied into that. There was a lot of drugs tied into that. It was a very big scene for the gay community. And it was out of the disco scene a lot that really the ravages of the AIDS epidemic happened. And that's another thing that I think is important to think about. So if you think about like psychedelic rock, and you think about free love and all this stuff that was happening in the late 60s and in the 60s, you have to understand that that's pre-AIDS. You all live, I think all of you, in a post-AIDS world. In other words, AIDS has been here since you've been born. It really showed up in the late 70s, even though it became more known and into the 80s. And some of the reasons for that is that there was, for a long time, a belief that it was a gay disease, and there were people that didn't care, like, oh, well, that, let that happen to them and whatever. But then they started to realize that it was, people were getting it through blood transfusions, and people were waking up that it was more complicated. Plus, you had people that were sleeping with both men and women, and so it was becoming a big thing. It did wipe out a huge community. And so that changed the landscape, and we still live in that. And sometimes in my face-to-face class, we'd have a little discussion about this. I would ask the students, like, how aware are you of AIDS, and is it still around, and is it still fatal, and all those sort of things. And it's amazing how many students really don't realize that, yes, it's still around. Yes, it's still fatal. There is medication that you can take that it kind of lessens the symptoms and the severity and prolongs the health. But it's still out there, and it's still something that's going on. When the birth control pill came along with in the late 60s and became popularized on through, there were some issues that really came up. And of course, one of them was that the male mindset then was like, well, great, I don't have to worry about protection. You've got that covered. But they missed the whole sexually transmitted diseases, which, until AIDS was, you could take penicillin or whatever and deal with it. But once you got to AIDS, then it became a much higher stakes. So you'll learn about that. And then out of funk and disco, we're going to get to hip hop / rap. And disco, a lot of the disco music, example that you'll hear is that Good Times by Chic becomes the foundation of Rapper's Delight. And So you're going to learn about hip hop and rap. And so one thing to understand about that is that hip hop back in the day wasn't really a musical term. It was a cultural term. It was a culture that came out of particularly the Bronx in New York. It's a very geographically specific. And then it began to expand. And hip hop was a culture of which it had a musical style known as rap. It had breakdancing. It had tagging, graffiti, and it had a certain element, a fashion element to it. And that was considered all hip hop culture. Now, when we talk with people, I would talk to students about rap versus hip hop, and we have very different ideas of that. Those are almost like two different genres, and I guess you could argue that they are. But back in the day, the term hip hop wasn't even a musical term. It was a cultural term. So you'll learn about that. You'll also learn about the rise of pop and alternative rock. So this is where we get to Madonna, Michael Jackson, Prince. You're going to learn about the New Romantics, Culture Club, Duran Duran. You're going to learn about the hair bands. The book talks about Poison, but the hairband thing really started with, I think, Motley Crue, and then really was best exemplified by Twisted Sister in some ways. Later, partially morphed into like Guns N' Roses. And that really was an offshoot of kind of where Kiss had gone. And so, when we learn about Kiss, they were a huge influence, particularly on concert promotion and concert production and merchandising. So their impact is really, you learned about them already, and that's quite significant. And then you're going to learn about alternative rock. So you had rock, and you had pop, and then you had these other bands that were becoming popular because of indie radio. And you'll learn about the indie bands, and indie just meant that you were on you weren't signed to a major label. That's all that means by indie, but it became almost kind of a genre in and of itself, even though it's not a genre type of thing. But they became popular, and then we're going to also learn about MTV. You're going to start off this chapter about MTV, and that's going to be my question for you. I'm not going to mention it here, but what date did MTV go on the air? And so what would this make it the anniversary of? And we're right there. So I'll tell you, because I always record these on Sundays, that's a good hint for you. So what year did it go on the air? What actual date, not just the year, the actual month, day, year, and then what anniversary are we celebrating of MTV? And that changed the game in a major way, because with MTV, it mattered as much, in some cases more, what you looked like than what you sounded like. And there were bands that made it big. There was a whole new wave of, new wave became a big thing, of one-hit wonders because they got their videos on MTV. So you're going to learn about the impact and popularity of MTV, which changed the game for a while. It actually, we're still dealing with the residual impact of that, even though MTV hasn't been viable as music television for quite a while now. But through MTV, they started, as things started to change, they put the Real World on, and that was really, it wasn't the first reality TV show of the modern era. That actually goes to Cops, but it really ushered in the whole state of television that we see nowadays. And so you can think about all the reality TV that's on there, and it was because it was cheap to produce, easy to produce. They paid the people very little, still that way. So that really changed the game. But MTV changed it significantly for popular music, initially here in the States, and then ultimately, of course, globally. And then you're going to learn about alienated rock. So then we're going to go even farther. You're going to learn about post-punk, bands like The Replacements and Husker Du and Fugazi and I don't remember if Minor Threat's in this one or the other one. I think Minor Threat's in here. You're going to learn about industrial rock. So you're going to learn about Nine Inch Nails and the precursors to that. Bands like the German band Einstürzende Neubauten, Skinny Puppy, Front 242. This also pushes it for some people. Industrial rock is really hard for some people to listen to. There's a very heavy percussive noise element to it. But interestingly enough, a lot of it's danceable in its own way. And you can certainly do, if you want to go down a fun rabbit trail on YouTube, you can look up, goth kids dancing and industrial kids dancing. And you're going to learn about gothic rock, industrial rock, trying to just catch the last ones here, speed metal and thrash. So you're going to learn about, the big three in speed metal, which is Metallica, Slayer, and Megadeth. And then all the offshoots. And they really changed the game. They were influenced by Queen and by... just totally blanked on the other band that Lemmy was in. You'll know it. You'll find it. And that did Ace of Spades. Why am I blanking on that? Oh, well, whatever. I'm not going to go back and edit it. Someone will know and put it in there. And then also, they really started the whole thing. They were influenced by punk that they were hearing, and they brought this new energy. And you went from heavy metal that had these high, screaming, operatic kind of vocals, more to that low, sometimes guttural screaming. That changed things a lot. You'll learn about death metal, and then we'll get to back to the roots rock with Bruce Springsteen. So he really harkened back to the influences of 50s rock and 60s rock, very influenced by Phil Spector's Wall of Sound, brings back that whole bar band rock mentality, telling stories about average folks, and bringing it all back home to where it is. So I like to end with Bruce. And in my class, a lot of times I would end with the song The River, which I think is a masterpiece of a pop song. The story that it tells, the way that it tells it, the way that Bruce uses the river as a metaphor and changes it throughout the course of the song. So if you haven't heard it, take the time. I have it. It's in the playlist. It's in the videos. Look at the lyrics. Think of it as a story. And think about the story and what happens to the relationship. It's very interesting, and it's the power of a great 3-minute song. It's interesting to me that over the years, the students I've had that have been like, I've never really paid attention to the words of songs, and a lot of these artists go to great effort to craft their lyrics, and so it's worth taking the time to sit down and think about it. And going back to Dylan, Bruce was very influenced by Dylan. And so his abilities, not only as an entertainer and showman, but as a writer, as a lyricist, are really quite profound. So that's it. This is last week. You know the drill. You're all pros by now. You got your discussions. Don't wait till the last minute. Get these things done so that you don't have to think about it. Get your discussion post in by Thursday. Get your announcement reply in by noon on Thursday. I already gave you what the question is earlier in the video. And so I think that's it. Keep cool. Looks like it's going to be a hot week ahead. And, we'll talk soon. Reach out as always if you need to. Take good care. Bye.